Imagine you're walking up the plaza toward the Barclays Center in Brooklyn.
Right. Just a normal evening out.
Exactly. It's a Tuesday night.
Yeah.
You've got a hot dog in one hand, you're wearing your favorite team's jersey, and you're really just trying to get inside to watch a basketball game.
Yeah, you're not looking for trouble.
Not at all. But suddenly, this man steps directly into your path, and he's flanked by several others, all wearing matching, militaristic uniforms and turbans.
Right.
He points a finger directly at your chest and tells you with absolute unwavering sincerity that because of your specific genetics, you are literally an ancient biblical demon.
Which is just a wild thing to hear on a Tuesday.
It's insane. He tells you that your ancestors stole his identity and that very soon he's going to enslave you. And while he's screaming all this into a megaphone, somebody else is standing like 3 feet away just filming your reaction.
Yeah, getting it all on camera.
Right. So welcome to this deep dive. Today we're taking on a mission to really unpack a dense, sobering stack of materials. We're looking at a highly detailed April 2026 monthly monitoring report, and we've also got several peer-reviewed academic and psychological analyses to go with it.
It's a pretty heavy stack of reading, honestly.
It really is, and all of it focuses on the specific, rapidly growing phenomenon, the surge in radical Hebrew Israelite, or RHI, activity.
And you really hit the nail on the head with that Barclays Center scenario because that's not some hypothetical thought experiment. That is a documented daily reality in major open centers right now.
Wow, really? Daily?
Oh, absolutely. But, before we dive into the anatomy of how these groups actually operate, we need to establish the why. Like, why are we looking at this specific report today?
I am so glad you brought that up because the context here is just critical.
Right. So the report describes our current geopolitical and social climate as an anti-Semitism emergency across several Western nations.
Which is a really strong phrase.
It is, but we are living in an extremely tense historical moment. Societal fractures are widening. Trust in institutions is basically plummeting. And what we're seeing is that extremist fringe groups are highly, highly opportunistic.
They see a crack and they just wedge themselves in.
Exactly. They actively capitalize on this collective anxiety. They step into the public square right when the public is already distracted or terrified by other global events.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So understanding the precise mechanics of these groups, how they hijack legitimate historical trauma, what they actually believe, and the psychological traps they use to recruit vulnerable people, it's basically a requirement for basic societal awareness in 2026.
It really is. And as part of that awareness, we have to lay down a strict, impartial disclaimer before we go literally one step further.
Yes, please do.
Because this is explicitly derived right from the first page of our source text, and it's totally non-negotiable for this discussion.
It's arguably the most important distinction we're going to make today.
Completely. So we are making a massive bright line differentiation between the broader historical Hebrew Israelite religious movement and the specific radical sects we're analyzing today.
Right, two very different things.
Entirely different. The broader movement includes thousands of peaceful, law-abiding practitioners who find, profound spiritual meaning in their faith.
Which is totally their right and not what this report is about.
Exactly. What we are analyzing today is the RHI fringe, the specific sects that espouse extremist, racially motivated, and exclusionary ideologies.
Right.
Our mandate for you listening today is to analyze the findings of this April 2026 report with total impartiality. We're not taking political sides here. We are just unpacking the data, the sociology, and the psychology presented in these documents.
And that distinction really provides our roadmap. We're looking at the radical fringe. And if we want to understand how this fringe operates, we really can't start with abstract theology.
No, we have to get into the reality of it.
Right. We have to start with the pavement. We have to look at their tactical operations on the streets and online over the past month.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that takes us straight into the data from the April 2026 snapshot. And honestly, the numbers in this monitoring report are just startling.
They really jump out at you.
They do. We're looking at a 14% increase in identity-based hate speech linked to these groups, just within a single 30-day window.
Which is a huge spike for 1 month.
Huge. But this spike isn't happening on, mainstream social media platforms where you might post your vacation photos. It's happening on decentralized digital platforms.
Right. The migration to platforms like Telegram and these specialized unmoderated forums is a massive tactical shift for them.
What does that actually mean, though, decentralized?
Well, a decentralized platform essentially means there is no central authority moderating the content. There's no corporate moderation team sitting in an office pulling down hate speech or violent rhetoric.
So it's basically the Wild West.
Exactly. It is the digital equivalent of an unregulated frontier.
But here's the detail in the report that completely threw me. The ideology isn't just growing in a vacuum on these platforms. It is actively mutating.
Yeah, that's where it gets really
The
complicated.
data shows RHI rhetoric is blending with sovereign citizen legal theories and hard-right rhetoric. And I read that and went, wait, hold on. Sovereign citizens.
I know, it sounds bizarre.
It really does. Those are the people who claim that, like, obscure maritime codes or common law loopholes mean they don't have to pay taxes or register their cars or recognize the authority of the police.
Right, the whole I am a living man, not a corporation thing.
Exactly. And that movement is historically associated with anti-government, often predominantly white, libertarian, or militia groups.
It is.
So how on earth does that mix with an extremist group that preaches white people are literal biblical demons? Logistically, that makes zero sense to me.
Well, you're looking for ideological consistency, which is a really common mistake when analyzing extremism.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's not about ideological purity for them. It's about anti-institutional synergy.
Anti-institutional synergy.
Wow. Right. This is what political scientists often call the horseshoe theory of extremism.
Where the ends kind of bend back toward each other.
Exactly. If you go far enough out to the radical fringes, opposing ideologies start to bend toward each other and they begin to overlap in their tactics.
That is fascinating.
It really is. Both the radical Hebrew Israelite fringe and the sovereign citizen movement share this foundational premise. They genuinely believe there is a hidden truth that completely invalidates the current legal and societal system.
Oh, I see. So if you believe the government is run by literal demonic imposters, of course you're going to adopt legal theories that say you don't have to pay taxes to them.
Precisely. The sovereign citizen rhetoric provides this sort of pseudo-legal framework for the RHI groups to resist the police when they're inevitably confronted during their aggressive street camps.
It's just a tool for them.
Exactly, it's a marriage of convenience. They borrow the legal jargon to bolster their theological rebellion.
Okay, that actually makes terrifying sense.
Yeah.
And speaking of jargon, the vocabulary they use is a huge part of this. The report spends a lot of time analyzing the specific linguistic tools these groups use to isolate their targets.
Right, the language is incredibly deliberate,
And the recurring theme in all this data is the Amalek narrative.
which is a very specific historical reference.
Yeah, so for those who might not have, a degree in ancient biblical history, Amalek was an ancient tribe described in the Hebrew Bible.
Right, they attacked the Israelites from behind when they were wandering in the desert.
Exactly. They specifically targeted the weak and the tired. Because of that cowardice, Amalek basically became the archetype of the eternal cosmic enemy.
And what's fascinating here is what the report highlights, how these radical sects take that ancient mythic label of Amalek and they just paste it directly onto modern Jewish people.
It's a profound manipulation.
It really is. They aren't criticizing a modern political state or even a specific individual policy. They are turning a living, breathing demographic into a mythological supervillain.
Wow. And the report specifically names groups doing this, right? Primarily Israel United in Christ, or IUIC, and the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge, which is ISUPK.
Yes, those are the main actors mentioned in the April data.
And they employ these identity theft allegations constantly. Like, they use the term Jewish, and they put this heavy, mocking emphasis on the ish to claim that mainstream Jewish communities are fake.
Right, they literally call them the synagogue of Satan.
It's so aggressive. They're basically saying, you aren't the real thing, you're just ish. You're almost, but actually, you're an imposter who stole our heritage.
And it's a deliberate rhetorical strategy designed to completely invalidate the existence of one group in order to elevate their own.
Because if you don't exist, I get to take your place.
Exactly. If you can convince your followers that the people currently holding a specific heritage are literal thieves and agents of the devil, well, you bypass any need for empathy.
Because you don't have to empathize with a demon.
Right. You've dehumanized them entirely.
And we see this lack of empathy weaponized in real time when global conflicts dominate the news. The report notes how these radical elements respond to the current ongoing tensions in the Middle East.
Which is a very sensitive topic right now.
Very. And the data shows they've increasingly aligned their rhetoric with anti-Zionist narratives out in the public square.
But And this is key. They distinguish themselves in a very specific, very aggressive way.
How so?
Well, when you see secular pro-Palestinian movements protesting, they are generally advocating for geopolitical outcomes, right?
Right.
Like a ceasefire or a two-state solution or human rights intervention.
Sure, tangible political goals.
Exactly. But the radical RHI fringe is not out there advocating for Palestinian liberation.
No, they are crashing these deeply tense public arenas to claim that they, and they alone, are the exclusive divine heirs to the land of Israel.
Right.
They're looking at a deeply complex, tragic geopolitical conflict and basically saying, actually, hold on, this is about us. The
Yeah.
people fighting over there are all imposters.
It is the ultimate hijacking of a global narrative.
It really is using a global tragedy as a personalized megaphone.
That's a great way to put it. They use the momentum of a massive public crisis to insert a completely exclusionary fringe theology. They aren't there to add to the geopolitical discourse at all.
They're just there to siphon attention away from it.
Exactly.
And siphoning attention is exactly what they do. And honestly, it gets so much darker when you read about how they exploit localized, unrelated tragedies.
Oh, the Golders Green incident.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the late April stabbings in Golders Green, London. This was a horrific, violent incident. A whole community was deeply traumatized by it.
Absolutely tragic.
Now, the official monitoring report clearly states that authorities link the primary suspects in those stabbings to entirely different extremist ideologies.
Right. It had absolutely zero connection to radical Hebrew Israelites.
Zero. Yet the UK-based RHI groups immediately jumped on the event.
They did.
They flooded their decentralized channels with claims that these stabbings were the vials of wrath being poured out by God on fake Israelites.
Right. Which is just a chilling way to frame a murder.
It's sickening. You take a community's raw, bleeding grief over a localized violent crime, and you warp the tragedy to fit a highly specific, totally unrelated narrative.
Right.
You're basically standing over a victim and telling your followers, look, see, God is proving our point.
It is purely opportunistic trauma exploitation. And the thing is, doing that effectively requires a really sophisticated delivery system.
Like the street camps.
Right. Historically, these groups relied on physical dominance of public space. We go back to your opening scenario at the Barclays Center.
With the guy with the megaphone.
Exactly. The report details how they maintain these camps in highly trafficked commercial or entertainment districts.
So you're trying to enjoy a normal evening out, right? Maybe catch a movie or a game. And you are confronted by a militarized camp handing out literature that explicitly calls white Europeans descendants of Esau or the devil, and they're just screaming slurs at passersby.
It is meant to be jarring. It's jarring by design.
But the crucial evolution noted in that April 2026 data, that 14% spike on Telegram, it shows how the physical street corner has evolved.
Right. The street corner is no longer the final destination for their message.
What is it then?
It's a film set.
Oh, wow. That makes so much sense.
Right. They aren't trying to convert the guy holding the hot dog.
No, of course not.
They're trying to provoke him into reacting.
They want him to snap.
Exactly. They use the aggressive physical presence to manufacture confrontational content. A pedestrian gets angry, yells back, maybe even gets physical.
Which is a totally natural human reaction to being screamed at.
Exactly. And the group films the whole altercation, edits it to make themselves look like these righteous truth tellers being persecuted by an evil, aggressive world, and then they blast that highly engaging, high-conflict video across their digital echo chamber.
That's horrifying. So it's a hybrid model.
Yes. This hybrid physical-digital model is exactly what makes modern extremism so volatile. A localized shouting match in Brooklyn literally becomes global propaganda in London 5 minutes later.
Okay, but this raises a huge question for me. To stand out there on a Tuesday night and scream these things at total strangers, you must have an incredibly complex, deeply ingrained internal worldview.
You absolutely do.
Because you don't just wake up one morning and decide to call a random teenager an ancient biblical enemy.
No, there's a deep structure behind it.
Right. Where do these specific racial and biblical claims actually come from? Because you mentioned they believe white Europeans are Esau. How do they arrive at that very specific conclusion?
Well, to really understand that, we have to open the academic section of our source material and decode the ideology.
Let's do it.
The origins of this specific radical framework trace back to a very particular time and place, the One West school of thought, which emerged in Harlem, New York in the late 1960s.
Okay, let's paint the picture of 1960s Harlem for a second. The civil rights movement is actively fracturing. You have the assassination of Malcolm X.
Right. A very turbulent time.
You have immense disillusionment with the nonviolent approach of the mainstream civil rights leaders. There's a huge vacuum of power, a vacuum of identity, and an overwhelming amount of systemic trauma.
It was a very raw era.
Yeah.
And in that exact crucible of historical pain, a figure named Abba Bivens breaks away from the more traditional existing Hebrew Israelite congregations, and he founds the One West camp.
And what made One West different?
Well, the absolute cornerstone of the One West ideology, the actual mechanism they use to completely redefine reality, is something called the 12 Tribes chart.
Ah, the chart. The sources break this chart down, and honestly, it is a staggering piece of pseudo-theological engineering.
Staggering is a good word for it.
They basically took the 12 biblical tribes of ancient Israel and mapped them directly onto modern racial and ethnic groups in the Americas.
And the mapping is highly specific and very rigid.
Walk us through it.
Okay, so according to the standard chart used by the radical fringe, the tribe of Judah represents African Americans.
Okay.
Benjamin represents West Indians or Jamaicans. Levi maps to Haitians. Ephraim and Manasseh are Puerto Ricans and Cubans. Gad is North American Indians, and Issachar represents Mexicans.
Okay, I am so stuck on this part. Here's where it gets really interesting to me.
Yeah.
You are in 1960s New York. How does a theology born in that specific era justify mapping descendants of the Aztec Empire, or the Taino people populations that were indigenous to the Americas for thousands of years before European contact, to misplaced Middle Eastern biblical tribes?
Right. On paper, it sounds crazy.
It does. Logistically, historically, genetically, it's completely absurd. So why do it? What is the utility of creating that specific chart?
Well, you're evaluating the chart as a historical document when in reality it is a psychological tool.
Oh, I see.
The One West founders were operating in a hyper-diverse, heavily marginalized urban environment. You had African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and indigenous descendants all living in incredibly close proximity.
And all dealing with similar struggles.
Exactly. All suffering under systemic poverty and racism. The chart was a brilliant, albeit totally fabricated tool to build a unified pan-minority coalition against a perceived common oppressor.
Wow. Okay.
It was a way of saying, we all suffer under the same system because secretly we are all part of the same royal family.
That provides immense psychological solidarity.
Yes, unity through shared mythology.
But it isn't just about inclusion for those specific groups, right?
Mm.
The dark side of the chart is that it is fundamentally about exclusion.
Absolutely. It is the foundation of the stolen identity narrative.
Because if you claim that Black, Hispanic, and Native American people are the only true Israelites,
then you automatically render mainstream Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews as imposters. The chart requires an enemy to function. It needs an antagonist.
and that brings us to the Esau and Edom concept, which is essentially the ideological engine for their racial animus, isn't it?
It is. In their theology, white Europeans are framed as the literal biological descendants of Esau, who is also known as Edom.
Right, and in the actual biblical narrative, Esau was the twin brother of Jacob, who sold his birthright for a bowl of stew.
Right. But the One West ideology extrapolates this ancient family drama to horrific extremes.
How far do they take it?
Because of this supposed biological lineage, white people are deemed inherently of the devil and are destined for destruction or literal enslavement when the Messiah returns.
Enslavement? Wait, really? They actually believe in a divine mandate for a future where they become the slave masters?
That is explicitly what they teach.
They're looking at the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, literally one of the darkest atrocities in human history. And their response is, we want to do that to them next.
Yes.
How do they possibly justify that theologically?
Through intense, highly weaponized biblical literalism. The sources highlight their heavy reliance on Deuteronomy chapter 28.
Okay, what's in that chapter?
This chapter contains a long list of curses that God warned would befall the Israelites if they ever disobeyed the covenant.
Right, it talks about being brought to a foreign land in ships.
Yes.
Having yokes of iron put on their necks, having their children sold away.
Exactly. The RHI groups read these ancient texts entirely literally, and they map them exclusively onto recent American history.
Oh.
They argue that because these specific horrors happened to Black Americans during the slave trade, it is undeniable, literal proof that they are the true Israelites experiencing the curses.
So they are taking the deepest generational trauma imaginable, the absolute worst thing that happened to their ancestors, and totally reframing it.
Reframing it as identity.
Yes. They're saying This wasn't just a brutal economic system of human trafficking.
Yeah.
This was a divine prophecy,
Yeah.
specifically identifying us as royalty.
It is a breathtaking reframing of trauma. It takes the agonizing chaos of history and gives it this very rigid divine order.
But the academic consensus provided in our sources makes a very critical distinction here, and I want to make sure we hit this clearly.
Please do.
The broader original Hebrew Israelite movement did not start this way at all.
No, not at all. If we want to understand the origins, we have to look at the late 19th century.
Right, figures like Frank Cherry and William Saunders Crowdy.
Exactly. Those early figures were operating right in the middle of the Jim Crow era. They were surrounded by lynchings and absolute legal disenfranchisement.
It was a nightmare.
It was. And for those early marginalized communities, adopting a biblical Israelite identity was a profound spiritual coping mechanism.
It was about dignity.
Exactly. It was a way to reclaim their dignity and spiritual sovereignty in a society that legally treated them as subhuman. They naturally identified with the biblical Israelites who were freed from slavery in Egypt.
So it was a theology of survival.
Pure survival and hope. But the exclusionary elements, the 12 tribes chart, the intense racial hatred, the specific mapping of white people as Esau destined for slavery, those were radical mutations.
Added way later.
Added much later by the One West camps in the 60s. They essentially took a theology of survival and weaponized it into a theology of supremacy.
Man, imagine the sheer cognitive load required to maintain that worldview every day.
That has to be exhausting.
It does. You're walking down the street, but you aren't seeing normal human beings. You are running every single person you see through this mythic filter.
Right.
You look at one person and think, okay, Edomite, destined for my enslavement. You look at another and think, oh, tribe of Issachar. It's just a paranoid way to live.
Which is exactly why the mythology requires absolute isolation to survive.
What do you mean?
Because the moment you introduce actual science into that worldview, the entire foundation just crumbles.
Okay, let's transition to the reality check, because our sources provide a massive amount of hard data on this.
They do.
And when academics, geneticists, and linguists evaluate the claims of that 12 tribes chart, it doesn't just fail. It completely shatters.
It really does. If we connect this to the bigger picture, let's start with the genetics.
Yeah, let's look at the DNA.
The DNA evidence is definitive at this point. The studies on African-American genetics consistently show a primary mixture of various West and Central African ancestries.
Right, specifically tracing back to groups like the Yoruba, Mende, and Igbo populations.
Exactly. Alongside varying degrees of European ancestry, of course. But the genetic science explicitly states there is no widespread overarching genetic marker linking the general African-American population specifically to ancient Levantine or Judean populations.
Okay, but when we talk about these genetic studies, I want to be super clear for the listener. We aren't talking about like a commercial mail-in cheek swab that gives you a fun little pie chart for your birthday.
Right, this isn't Ancestry.com.
Exactly. What are these peer-reviewed studies actually measuring to be so certain about this?
Well, they are looking at deep ancestral haplogroups.
Okay.
Specifically, they analyze Y chromosomal DNA, which traces the direct paternal lineage from father to son.
Got it.
And they also look at mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which traces the direct maternal lineage. These markers basically allow geneticists to track human migration patterns over thousands and thousands of years.
So they can see exactly where a population originated.
Exactly. And the markers prevalent in ancient Judean populations simply do not appear as a primary widespread foundation in the demographics that the One West chart targets.
So the biological data completely invalidates the claim that the transatlantic slave trade primarily captured the descendants of ancient Israelites.
It does, completely.
And the genetic data doesn't just disprove the RHI claims about themselves. It completely demolishes their claims that modern Jewish people are imposters.
Oh, absolutely. The sources cite incredibly comprehensive, peer-reviewed studies here.
Which ones?
Specifically, Hammer et al. In the year 2000, and Behar et al. In 2000. These were massive global undertakings.
And what did those studies actually find?
They found that most modern Jewish populations, whether they're Ashkenazi from Eastern Europe, Sephardic from the Iberian Peninsula, or Mizrahi from the Middle East, they share a remarkably high degree of genetic commonality with each other.
Across all those different geographical groups?
Yes. And crucially, they also share high commonality with other non-Jewish Levantine and Middle Eastern populations.
Yeah.
The genetic data literally proves that their biological roots in the Levant, have remained consistent over millennia despite the entire global diaspora.
So the entire identity theft narrative, the whole Jewish slur,
Hmm.
it's entirely fabricated.
Completely fabricated.
The genetics prove the historical continuity of the Jewish people. But they don't just fail the DNA test, right? The sources say they fail the linguistics test, too.
Spectacularly.
Yeah, we were talking earlier about how the 12 tribes chart maps Mexicans and Puerto Ricans to the tribes of Issachar and Ephraim.
Right. And from a linguistic standpoint, it is entirely indefensible.
Because of the language roots.
Exactly. The evidence shows that indigenous Native American language families like Uto-Aztecan in Mexico or Arawakan in the Caribbean, they have absolutely zero structural, grammatical, or even etymological links to Semitic languages like Hebrew.
They're just totally different trees.
Exactly. They belong to entirely different language trees that developed independently, separated by vast oceans over thousands of years.
Right, so claiming they are the same is like claiming, I don't know, a pine tree and a jellyfish share a recent common ancestor just because they both live on Earth.
That's a great analogy. It requires an active denial of basic reality.
It really does. And, we also have to address the Khazar myth because that seems to be a foundational pillar of their anti-Semitic rhetoric in the report.
It is a massive talking point for them.
They claim that Ashkenazi Jews are exclusively the descendants of an 8th century Central Asian group called the Khazars, who supposedly just converted to Judaism en masse.
Right.
And I feel like I've seen this myth pop up in various conspiracy circles for years. What is the actual academic consensus on this?
The consensus is that it is a gross historical exaggeration that has been weaponized as a slur.
So it's not true.
Well, some historical records suggest a portion of the Khazar nobility may have converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages. But geneticists, linguists, and historians universally agree that this isolated event does not account for the primary ancestry of the Ashkenazi diaspora.
Right, because the genetic studies we literally just mentioned rule it out.
Explicitly rule it out. It is a debunked hypothesis that survives solely because it provides a really convenient excuse to call someone a fake Jew.
Which is like finding an old forged map that finally puts your hometown at the exact center of the universe. It feels incredibly validating for you, but if you actually try to use it to navigate reality, you're going to crash.
Exactly. And when you look at this entire package, the fabricated genetics, the non-existent linguistic connections, the reliance on these debunked medieval myths, it becomes glaringly obvious why civil rights organizations classify this stuff the way they do.
Like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the Anti-Defamation League.
Right. They classify the core tenets of this radical fringe as flat-out pseudo-history.
And the SPLC actually points out a deep, kind of terrifying parallel in the sources, right?
They do. If you look at the ideological architecture of the radical Hebrew Israelites, it perfectly mirrors the white supremacist Christian identity movement.
Wait, the Christian identity movement?
Yeah.
Like the one heavily associated with the Aryan nations and the Ku Klux Klan?
Yes. That exact movement.
That is wild.
It is. The Christian identity movement believes that white Europeans are the true Israelites, that minorities are subhuman mud peoples, and that Jewish people are the literal offspring of Satan.
Oh my God.
And the RHI theology uses the exact same pseudo-historical machinery. They have simply swapped the variables.
They just changed the colors on the map?
Exactly. They changed which race is considered the chosen and which is biologically damned. But it is the identical architecture of hate, just operating under a completely different racial banner.
That is staggering. They essentially plagiarized the theology of their own oppressors.
They really did.
But this raises a really profound psychological question for me.
What's that?
If I have a strong belief about something, and you sit me down and show me peer-reviewed DNA evidence, linguistic history, and archaeological data proving my belief is completely wrong, I might be embarrassed. I might be defensive at first. But I will eventually change my mind, because the facts are the facts. Why do group members actively reject the proof? Like, why does a literal DNA test not break the spell?
Because when your entire identity, your sense of self-worth, and your literal eternal salvation are inextricably tied to a belief, scientific facts are no longer processed by the brain as data.
What are they processed as then?
They are processed as existential threats. A DNA test isn't just a cheek swab to a radicalized member.
Right.
It is perceived as a tool of the Edomite conspiracy actively trying to steal their divine crown.
Oh, wow. So they've built a psychological fortress where evidence of being wrong is actually just proof that the conspiracy against them is real.
Exactly. It makes the belief completely unfalsifiable.
Which means the explosive growth of these groups, the 14% spike we discussed earlier, it's not based on the strength of their historical arguments at all?
No, nobody is joining because they read a compelling linguistic thesis on the Arawakan language.
Right. They're joining because of the sophisticated strength of the group's psychological control.
And that is the terrifying pivot of this deep dive.
It is. If the science completely dismantles the ideology, how do they recruit? And more importantly, how do they keep people locked in?
The answer lies in the mechanics of control.
Let's get into the psychological analysis, because the sources break this down using classic high-control group dynamics.
Yeah.
In colloquial terms, we're basically talking about cult tactics.
We are. And it all begins with the exploitation of what the text calls the identity void.
We touched on this earlier with the generational trauma, but let's go deeper. The transatlantic slave trade did something uniquely horrific.
It did.
It didn't just enslave bodies. It systematically destroyed historical records, it severed family lineages, and it intentionally erased cultural identities.
It created a massive, agonizing void for millions of descendants.
And the recruiters for these radical sects are basically predators of that exact void.
They absolutely are. They offer a hidden history that provides immediate, absolute answers to that void. They approach someone who is struggling with the chaotic, deeply unfair reality of systemic racism, and they completely reframe it as divine prophecy.
They say, you aren't suffering because the world is cruel. You are suffering because you are God's chosen elite, serving a temporary divine sentence.
And the sentence is almost over.
God, it's the ultimate psychological lure.
It is.
You walk up to someone who feels completely marginalized, who feels like a victim of history, and you tell them they are actually the main character of the universe.
Of course they want to believe it. It feels incredible.
But once they take that bait, the trap snaps shut.
And the report details how the indoctrination aligns perfectly with the BITE model.
Yes, let's break this down. The BITE model, developed by Dr. Stephen Hassan, is basically the gold standard for analyzing high-control groups.
Right. It stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion control.
Okay, let's take those one by one, starting with behavior control. How do they actually physically restrict their members?
Well, it starts with strict dress codes. Mandatory wearing of fringes or turbans for the men, extreme modesty standards for the women.
So they visibly separate them from the rest of society immediately.
Exactly. There are also rigid dietary laws, but honestly, the most insidious form of behavior control is the schedule.
The schedule?
Yes. Mandatory exhaustive camp attendance, constant street preaching, endless late-night scriptural study sessions.
So they just keep them busy.
They monopolize the members' time so completely that physical exhaustion sets in. And when you are chronically exhausted, your ability to think critically severely drops.
Wow, so you literally don't have the energy to question things.
Right. And while you are exhausted, they implement information control.
The I in BITE?
Exactly. They institute what they call the bubble. Members are actively taught that mainstream historians, geneticists, public schools, basically all secular institutions are inherently deceptive.
They dismiss all outside history as Edomite lies.
Right. And if you aren't allowed to read anything that contradicts the group.
You can never realize you're in a trap.
Yeah, exactly. You only consume their media.
Then we reach thought control, the T. And this is where it gets incredibly manipulative in the sources. The report mentions the creation and enforcement of something called Lashawan Kadash.
Yes.
Wait, did they literally invent their own language?
They did. It is a fabricated, reconstructed, frankly broken version of ancient Hebrew.
Okay, but why? Why go through the trouble of inventing a language?
Because the utility of it is immense for thought control. In linguistics, there's this concept related to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Which means what, exact?
It suggests that the language you speak actively shapes how you are able to think.
Oh, wow.
Right. So by forcing members to learn and use this unique language, and by embedding specific dehumanizing slurs for outsiders into their daily vocabulary, they are literally rewiring the member's brain.
That is chilling. If you don't even have a word for friend or neighbor that can apply to someone outside the group, you literally lose the neurological ability to conceptualize an outsider as a friend.
Exactly. You stop speaking the same language as your family, both literally and figuratively.
That brings us to emotion control, the E.
And this is managed through a highly volatile cycle of love bombing and phobia indoctrination.
Let's talk about love bombing, because the honeymoon phase is how it always starts, right?
Yes. A new recruit is just showered with attention. They're given a new Hebrew name. They're called brother or sister by dozens of people who suddenly care deeply about them.
They're basically handed the community, respect, and validation they have been desperately seeking their whole lives.
Exactly. But the report details a very specific dark transition.
Right. I want to look closely at the street preaching tactic again, because the sources reframe this entirely for me. Initially, I just assumed sending recruits out onto the street with megaphones was about, gaining new members.
That's what most people think.
But you mentioned earlier it's actually a mechanism of internal control.
It is.
How does sending a new recruit out to scream at people control the recruit?
It is an ego-stripping exercise disguised as a divine duty.
Walk me through that.
Put yourself in the recruit's shoes for a second. You have just found this incredibly loving brotherhood. Suddenly, they tell you that to truly prove your faith, you must stand on a street corner and shout inflammatory, hateful rhetoric at passersby.
Oh.
When you do this, normal pedestrians inevitably react with anger, disgust, or mockery. They yell back at you, they might spit at you, they call you crazy.
And the group leaders are standing right there, just watching this happen to you.
Yes. And they use that negative reaction to solidify the programming.
Ow.
The leader puts an arm around the shaken recruit and says, "See? We told you the world is evil. We told you they hate you, just like the prophecies said. The only people who love you, the only people who understand the truth are right here in the camp."
Oh my God. It's an inoculation against society.
It is trauma bonding on a street corner.
They intentionally manufacture a traumatic public rejection so the recruit runs back to the safety of the cult. That is brilliantly evil. So what does this mean for the recruit long term? Why would someone willingly subject themselves to that over and over?
Because it hardens them against the outside world and it reinforces absolute emotional dependence on the camp. And if the member ever steps out of line internally, that manufactured love is instantly withdrawn.
The rebukes.
Yes. They face intense public shaming sessions within the camp. The recruit ends up living in a constant state of hypervigilance, terrified of losing the only community they have left.
Fear really is the ultimate glue here. Once that honeymoon phase is over, the end times fear-mongering just takes over completely.
And the impending day of the Lord.
Right. They convince the member that if they leave the camp, or even if they doubt the leaders, they will be violently destroyed alongside the rest of the non-Israelite world during the apocalypse.
This creates the ultimate psychological trap, which is the sunk cost fallacy.
I use the startup analogy for this all the time.
Yeah, how does that go?
It's like taking your entire life savings, cashing out your 401k, mortgaging your house, and dumping every single penny into a startup company.
Right.
3 years later, the CEO is indicted for fraud, the product is an obvious scam, and the office is empty. But instead of walking away, you take out another loan.
Because admitting you were wrong is too painful.
Exactly. Because if you admit it's a scam, you have to go home, look your family in the eye, and say, "I ruined our lives for absolutely nothing." So instead, you double down on the delusion.
And with these groups, you have to multiply that feeling by your eternal soul and your entire social network.
Wow.
A member might give up their slave name, quit their secular career, and spend a decade aggressively alienating their non-member family and friends.
Burning every bridge.
Every single one. After 10 years, even if a crack forms in the programming, even if they realize the 12 tribes chart makes absolutely no historical sense, or they catch a leader in a massive lie, leaving means admitting they threw a decade of their life away.
It means facing a world they spent 10 years verbally abusing entirely alone.
Exactly. The psychological wall is just too high to climb.
The report also notes that they target very specific vulnerabilities to get people over that wall in the first place, right?
Yes, the demographics are very intentional. They specifically target foster youth who lack stable family structures. They target military veterans struggling to reintegrate post-service.
Because veterans are used to a rigid, militaristic hierarchy.
Precisely. And they also target neurodivergent individuals, like those on the autism spectrum, who might be actively seeking rigid structure and absolute black and white rules.
It is so insidious to provide rigid structure to someone with social anxiety or institutional instability and turn their genuine need for safety into a tool for manipulation.
It's incredibly predatory.
It is devastating to think about someone trapped behind that psychological wall. But here is the tragic reality that moves this from just a personal tragedy to a massive societal crisis.
The outward projection.
Yes. This psychological control doesn't just damage the individual inside the camp. The group's entire theology requires that individual to actively project harm outward.
Right, the internal manipulation demands external societal collateral damage,
And that brings us to the theology of exclusion.
which is really the core of the danger to the public.
The academic sources draw a very sharp, necessary contrast here between compassionate spirituality and the RHI radical ideology.
Right, because mainstream spiritual traditions, regardless of the specific religion, generally strive for some form of universalism.
The idea that the divine is accessible to all of humanity.
Exactly. And that character, empathy, and your deeds are the actual metrics of a spiritual life.
But the RHI worldview is the exact inverse of that.
Completely. The text explicitly states they view spirituality strictly through a biological or DNA lens.
Which is wild.
It is. Your standing with God is determined entirely by your genetics at birth. If you are born white, you are biologically an Edomite and inherently evil.
So your actions, your kindness, your personal beliefs, none of it matters.
None of it. It completely removes any requirement for human empathy.
It's a theology of pure revenge.
Yes. They take the valid historical pain of systemic racism, and instead of seeking healing or equality or social harmony, they weaponize it into a fantasy of future oppression.
The gospel for these radical sects is not about salvation for the world.
No, it is about a literal violent reversal where current minorities become the slave masters.
It's like a spiritual pyramid scheme.
Yeah.
The only way you can feel elevated is if you are actively pushing someone else down to the bottom tier.
That's a perfect way to describe it. But they don't just wait for this apocalyptic reversal to happen magically.
No, they act out this dominance right now on the streets.
Right. The April 2026 reports highlight some deeply concerning targeted harassment campaigns.
What were they doing?
Well, community workers in Brooklyn and Philadelphia reported that RHI street preachers specifically targeted LGBTQ+ people of color.
Wait, really? They're targeting marginalized people within their own broader communities.
Yes, heavily. They utilize public shaming, aggressive verbal abuse, and physical intimidation tactics against these individuals.
And how do they justify that?
They frame it as a quote-unquote correction tactic. They claim they're cleansing their community of Edomite influence.
It is a twisted, predatory form of harassment just disguised as religious outreach.
Exactly. And they're bringing this to college campuses, too.
The educational outreach.
Right. The report notes they're actively distributing historical revisionist pamphlets directly at Black student unions on university campuses.
They're trying to convince young, educated students who are just exploring their identity that the slave trade was a prophetic punishment that actually proves their superiority.
They are trying to recruit the next generation of leaders.
But the most toxic element regarding their own communities is undoubtedly the two-thirds doctrine.
Ah, yes, the two-thirds doctrine.
I am still stuck on this concept. You build this entire elaborate, fabricated theology to elevate your specific racial group as the divine chosen royalty of the universe.
Right.
And then you turn around and literally condemn a massive majority of them to death. How does that not cause mass cognitive dissonance?
Well, it is the purity spiral inherent in all extremist movements.
Purity spiral.
Yes. You always need an in-group within the in-group to maintain the feeling of elite superiority. The two-thirds doctrine refers to a biblical prophecy in Zechariah that they completely twist out of context.
What do they claim it means?
They claim it means that two-thirds of their own people, two-thirds of all Black, Hispanic, and Native American people are wicked, non-compliant, and must be violently destroyed by God.
Wow. So if you are a Black man walking past their camp and you refuse to join their sect, or you argue with them,
They immediately label you a two-thirds.
and they use this slur to justify screaming at and hating their own neighbors, their own friends, even their own non-compliant family members.
Yes. It is a mechanism to insulate the cult. It allows them to dismiss any criticism from within their own demographic as just the babbling of the condemned.
This escalating behavior raises massive, massive legal questions. When you have targeted harassment of the LGBTQ+ community, when you have street-level racial abuse directed at random passersby, where's the line?
This raises an important question, and authorities in both the UK and the US are actively evaluating this right now.
What are they looking at?
The legal debate centers on whether this highly aggressive street preaching crosses the threshold from protected religious expression into incitement to hatred.
Under the new laws.
Right. Under the updated 2026 Public Order Acts, they are looking at public harassment thresholds.
Because freedom of religion is a bedrock principle, absolutely. But it's not a blank check to actively target individuals for racial or homophobic abuse on a public sidewalk.
Exactly. And the source analysis points out a profound philosophical reality about their worldview that ties into this legal issue.
What's that?
When you reject agnostic, humanist, or scientific perspectives on humanity, when you reject the fact that race is largely a social construct and that genetically we share overwhelmingly the exact same DNA, you completely bypass the golden rule.
Because if you convince yourself the person standing across from you isn't human, you don't owe them humanity.
It's the ultimate ethical loophole. Almost all major philosophies and religions have some form of the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you.
Right, it's universal.
But if others are reclassified as biological demons, the rule no longer applies. The intentional cruelty of screaming slurs on a street corner isn't a lapse in judgment for a radicalized member.
It's the whole point.
Exactly. It is a required righteous performance to prove they have completely cut themselves off from a corrupt world.
Man, it just paints an incredibly bleak picture. You have vulnerable people being trapped by their own generational trauma, weaponized into agents of hatred by manipulative leaders, and then set loose to harass their own communities.
It is a dark cycle.
It is. And if you were listening to this right now and thinking this is entirely hopeless, these people are completely lost, it is actually not that simple.
No, there is hope.
Because as dark as this gets, the source material actually provides a very specific, deeply human off-ramp for those caught inside the movement.
It does. The final section of our analysis is a direct appeal to the human element. It summarizes the ultimate cost of this ideology, but also the path out.
The sources talk about the weight of a stolen life. And it makes a brilliant, empathetic point.
It really does.
There is a stark, profound difference between a legitimate search for your ancestral roots and being held captive by a narrative of hate.
Right, because the desire to know who you are, the desire to find your origins, especially when historical atrocities like slavery have intentionally tried to erase them, that is a noble, valid, beautiful hunger.
It is a universal human drive to know exactly where we come from.
Exactly. The tragedy of the RHI radical fringe is that it intercepts that valid hunger for belonging and it feeds it poison.
It really does.
Yeah.
It demands a sacrifice of your future, your empathy, and your own mind, all on the altar of historical resentment.
And the cost of staying in one of these high-control camps is absolute devastation for the individual. The sources listed out meticulously.
Yeah, you experience the death of critical thinking because you are forced to reject science, genetics, and history.
You suffer the severing of genuine human connection because you're required to view everyone outside your small bubble as a devil or a two-thirds.
You lose your personal agency because camp leaders dictate the clothes you wear, the language you speak, and the way you spend your time.
And most tragically, as the psychological text notes, you are profoundly re-traumatized.
Right. People go to these groups seeking safety and healing from a harsh, racist world.
And they end up being exploited, financially and emotionally, by leaders who just profit off their devotion and anger.
But the path forward is possible. People do leave these groups.
They absolutely do.
The sources emphasize that you can reclaim your identity without the hate. You can honor your heritage, you can study real history, you can utilize legitimate genealogical science and DNA testing without ever needing a forged 12 tribes chart.
You can realize that true community is voluntary. It is based on mutual respect and shared values, not on fear, absolute obedience, and public rebukes.
It is an invitation to re-enter reality.
Yes. To choose the messy, beautiful complexity of the real world over the rigid, hateful simplicity of the cult. It takes immense courage to walk away, but the recovery of your own mind is worth it.
It absolutely is. So to you listening right now, the takeaway from this massive stack of reports is immense. It shows how quickly a legitimate search for community and identity can become an imprisonment if critical thinking is completely abandoned.
It happens so fast.
Remember that scenario at the Barclays Center we started with? The angry man shouting through the megaphone?
Right.
He is trapped. He traded the complexity of the world for a rigged compass. It offered him a map of supremacy, but it only led him to total isolation.
And the only way out is to drop the rigged compass. You realize you don't need a fake map to have dignity.
You just need the courage to look at the real world, as complex and flawed as it is, and walk your own path. And that leaves us with one final, lingering thought to chew on as we wrap up. We've spent this entire time dissecting how these high-control groups thrive by offering simple, absolute answers to incredibly complex historical traumas.
They prey on that identity void.
But what does that say about the rest of society? If people are so desperate for belonging, so hungry for a sense of worth, that they will accept a theology of pure hate just to feel seen and protected? Are we leaving the door wide open for extremists?
It's a heavy question.
Are we failing as a society to provide genuine, healthy spaces for healing? Are we failing to help people navigate the heavy ghost of history and simply letting the radicals do it for us? Keep asking questions. Keep challenging the simple answers. We will catch you on the next deep dive.